introduction. You'll be pleased to know it's been now reduced somewhat, and I shan't be going on for too long. Anyway, as most people, it's often been a bit of a cliche, of course, when they say that our speaker needs an introduction, but genuinely in this case, I have to say it's true. Randjbar-Daemi has been one of the, if not the leading historian of modern Iran, one whose works we are all familiar with, and certainly in my case is Iran Between Two Revolutions and Khomeiniism, as well as his numerous articles, have been an extraordinary influence on my own writing, not only in the opinions and the analysis that he provides, but also, and this is, I think, is very important for those of us who are interested in history, in the methodology which he puts towards his work. It's rigorously referenced. There's a lot of deep scholarship in his work, and he's one of the few historians of modern Iran, I would say, or historians of Iran full stop, who has been able in many ways to transcend that bridge between European or Western histories and Iranian history. And quite aside from his books, I'd encourage you, in particular his numerous articles that have been very profound, in my view certainly, in shaping our understanding not only of Iranian political development, but of social movements in particular. So as I said, it gives me very, very great pleasure to welcome ERVAND. He is here, as I should mention, as the IB TAURIS keynote lecturer, and he will be talking for approximately 1 hour on the subject of the 28th of Mordad revisited. Professor ABRAHAMIAN.
Thank you, Ali, for that introduction. History is about arguments, or to be more academic, it's about thesis, counter-thesis, explanations. Unfortunately, much of what is passed as Iranian history tends to be just digging up facts about the past. And since much of the past about Iranian history is interesting, that becomes interesting, but it's not really history. Also, history is not about good stories, narrative. I know the word narrative is now almost used constantly, but what passes often as narrative, if it's good narrative, it has underlying it some sort of argument. So when we look at anything in the past, even if it's presented as a narrative, especially in the British school of historiography, there is often hidden under it an agenda or an argument that is being given. Now, with the Mr. Mordad, we are actually in a position to have different arguments and to actually have a discussion in Iranian history of different rival explanations and try to sort out what these explanations differ and which tends to be more valid. And of course, when in history there are arguments, clearly there is a political aspect to it. When someone says, well, this is not about money, you know it is about money. So when a historian says, well, this is not about politics, you know often there is a political side to it. So one shouldn't shy away from that. These arguments do relate to politics, but the question is not to get carried away and distort reality, keep to the facts, and try to have an explanation that is based on the facts. And facts tend to be actually stubborn things. If you try to jump over them or ignore them, as early 20th century politicians said, you're likely to get spiked by the facts. So one really has to keep to the facts as much as possible. So it's good 60 years after the event that we can have actually an academic discussion about the different arguments that there are about Mr. Mordad. So I'd like to thank, of course, Oliver Siavush, Manchester University, for having put together this conference where we can, in fact, look at different explanations of Mr. Mordad. What I'm going to do today is really focus on giving a critique of what is now passed as the liberal explanation for Bast-Mordad, an explanation which has become, I would say, the dominant, the conventional explanation that is accepted by most of the mainstream writers, including newspapers, when they look at the coup. But before I get to my main thesis of my paper, critique of the liberal explanation, just a word about the royalist explanation. I think there'll be more about this later, but just to get that out of the way before we really tackle to the much more complicated explanation that I think most people accept, especially in the West now, about the coup. The royalist explanation has been basically that this was a popular uprising, Qiyam-e Milli, that it wasn't a military coup, but a Qiyam-e Milli. And this, of course, in recent years has, even I would say in recent months, has become preeminent with the whole looking at the 53. Although it seems new, in fact, it's the oldest explanation. If you go back to 53, right after the coup, President Eisenhower, ironically in a speech called Peace with Justice, basically said that what had happened in Iran was there was a popular uprising against the dictator Mossadegh. And that was the explanation, that was the official explanation given at that time. And if you look at much of the writing at the time, this was in fact the picture of what had happened, that Mossadegh had alienated so many people because he was flirting with communism, he had antagonized the clergy, he had closed down the Majlis, he had created economic problems, and the public was so outraged that they rose up spontaneously and overthrew him on Bast-Mordad. Now, this would make sense, I would say, if on Bast-Mordad you had huge crowds in Tehran overthrowing the regime. And by means, of course, the term crowd in Iran at that time would be a crowd of, let's say, 50, 60, 70,000 people. If there was such an event, one could very much say there was a popular uprising, Qiyam-e Milli. But the reality was that at most you had a crowd of, I wouldn't even say a crowd, gangs of 3,000, 4,000 at most on Bast-Mordad. And we know from basically eyewitness accounts and also from intelligence services, Western services who supported the coup, that this was a pretty motley crowd. Who were these people who formed the 4,000 at most people? Well, some people obviously were organized by Chavukeshan from southern Tehran. Some were members of various right-wing parties that were obviously participated in the coup. Some people may have been from Fedayeen Islam, even though that's controversial. But many of them were actually peasants that were brought in by trucks, and according to Roosevelt, trucks were paid for by the CIA. And some of them actually could have been tribesmen brought in. Just before I came to this conference, I got an unsolicited email from a CIA official who was there, and he saw a lot of tribesmen there. He wanted to know if I knew what tribes they came. He thought they were Bakhtiaris. I didn't think the Bakhtiaris were involved, but he was convinced that there were plenty of tribesmen that were brought in with weapons, actually, and with tribal gear. It would be good to have photographs. Then, of course, with the photographs you could tell what tribe they were. So at most you're really dealing with 3,000, 4,000 people. You know who they were organized by, and of course it's not spontaneous. So you can't really talk about a spontaneous uprising. And then the question becomes how important was the CIA or MI6 in organizing these groups? And if you look at some of the eyewitness accounts, this was not a type of crowd that could have destroyed the regime. We have eyewitness accounts from Nirue Sevom party, where they say that these gangs broke into Nirue Sevom offices, but there were so few people that they couldn't ransack the place. They had to wait until trucks full of soldiers were brought in, and their officers then ordered the troops to ransack the place. So the army basically had to even do what would be considered something that a mob would do. So in the final analysis, what we see on this Randjbar-Daemi is really a military coup where the so-called crowd has acoustical side effects to it. It is not really central to the story of what was happening. So if one was going to look at the indigenous side of the coup, one would really need to look at some 40 army officers who were crucial in carrying out the coup, the people who had the tanks, brought in the tanks, why they were able to bring in the tanks. That would be a good area to investigate, to find out. And there's an irony in this, of course, these would be considered the heroes of the coup, but the Riame Melis doesn't actually have heroes. The people are so-called the heroes, but very few army officers wanted to advertise their role in the coup. Besides Zahedi, most of the others tended to actually play down their role. So here it's a very sort of strange situation. If it's a Riame Medli, then you would expect many people to be proud of having participated in this popular uprising. Why so few people were willing to take credit for it explains actually then why the Riame Medli was not really sold to the public as a true revolt. People considered to see it really as a coup, especially a coup done from outside. Now, turning to actually the main argument of my talk, critique of the liberal interpretation of the coup. Now, if you look at most of the writing, and it's good, basically, historical writings on the coup, you find there is really two threads in the underlying the liberal interpretation. One is that, the coup was a tragedy, it was bad, it led to horrible things, dictatorship, and made that the underline eventually to the Islamic Republic. And of course it's admitted that the CIA played a major role in this. But what the liberal interpretation invariably argues is that it could have been prevented if Mossadegh had been willing to compromise. If Mossadegh had accepted the offers that were given to him, there would have not been a coup because good offers were given, and it was his intransigence that really led to basically the inevitability of the coup. So you find even very sympathetic books to Mossadegh, Kinzer, for instance, Christopher de la Blague. Both of them sort of worship Mossadegh, but the bottom line in their works is that they argue basically, they put the burden eventually on Mossadegh's shoulders that he could have settled because he was given a reasonable offer. Here, just to sum up, I don't like to read a lot from stuff, but just to give you the flavor of it, the Washington Post reviewing de Balague's book, and the reviewer was obviously an Iranian highly sympathetic to Mossadegh, concludes by saying, quote, Mossadegh could have agreed to a compromise that would have salvaged the would salvage both British and Iranian pride. Most Iranians would have accepted whatever concession he deemed necessary to an honorable resolution. Belag writes, the tragedy is that he never asked them to do so, i.e., a settlement was possible because the British and the Americans had offered him a good settlement. And this is a trend you will find, I would say, in the dominant liberal explanation of it. Even when the New York Times released the Wilbur papers, they again put the final responsibility on Mossadegh that he didn't accept what was given to him. So this is the one basic trend you would find in now the conventional wisdom. The second trend, equally important but also tied to this, is that the coup had absolutely nothing to do with oil. That was really not an issue. The coup was really about the fear of communism, the danger of the Soviet Union, and therefore the coup is so entirely in the context of the Cold War. And again, you'll find these in the interpretations both now and at the time. In fact, when Roosevelt first wrote his book, he says quite clearly that, yes, the British were interested in oil, but of course we were not. The Americans were not thinking about oil. They were worried about the Cold War. So I think these two arguments have been repeated so much that they've become actually accepted wisdom. So even in Iran, you find people who are very sympathetic to the Mossadegh. They even buy these two arguments and basically say that there was an offer on the table, and the fact that the offer was not taken was the responsibility of Mossadegh. Now, some people then have different explanations why Mossadegh didn't do it. Some people say, like Kinsler says, well, he had a Shia martyrdom complex, so he couldn't do it. Some say, well, he was because he was Iranian, incapable of reaching a compromise. Some people will talk about his worry because people will tear him apart if he compromised. So there are different explanations why he couldn't compromise. But always underlying the argument is that there was a compromise on the table he could have accepted. Now, my argument is that both these two basically underlying themes don't hold water when you actually look at the documents, what was going on at the time. The argument that the Americans and the British placed in front of him a reasonable compromise is something, of course, at that time was constantly given in the press. And that was something that the American publics were always accepted. It was something that was the press said, this is what is on the table. But if you actually look at the negotiations, what was going on behind closed doors, what was policy positions of both United States and Britain, the picture is very different. Right from the beginning, the British were insistent that nationalization would not be accepted. So from day one, the British position is that we cannot accept actual Iranian taking over, nationalizing the industry. And obviously, the reason why they didn't is clear enough. But there was also other reasons, actually more complicated reasons they gave in, these would be in the policy papers of the Ministry of Fuel and Power. Their argument was that if Iran, or countries like Iran, controlled their own production of oil, they could really do whatever they wanted with it. They might decide that oil is more valuable underground than overground, so why not just keep it there, just produce the minimum of what you need, and then sell as little as you need. And this actually comes down as early as 1945, when the Soviet-Iranian oil agreement is being talked. The British are saying that even before nationalization is an issue, that if you look at it logically, it's not in our interest to have a country like Iran have control over their own industry. So this was basically a stand position that the British had from the very beginning. And they continued this position that nationalization is not acceptable, not just for Iran, for United Britain, but also for other Western countries, oil-producing countries. So even what you find is Western advisors that Iran had, like Levy, Thornburg, they always in Iran sounded like they were pro-Iranian, anti-British, and they were presented themselves as anti-British. But they were as adamant against nationalization as the AIOC. Their gripe with AIOC wasn't on the issue of nationalization. Their gripe was that AIOC was being too stingy, not providing enough 50-50 deal, and therefore, basically, if the AIOC had been more generous, there was no problem. But when it came to the question of nationalization, they considered this basically a taboo. This was not something that was going to be acceptable, and the argument they gave sounded rational to some people at that time, that Iran was not capable of running its own industry, then therefore it was really not practical to run the industry. This turned out to be not true, because later on with the World Bank, when they came, they saw that Iran could actually run the industry even without the British technicians. The problem was exporting the oil, not actually running the industry. So the British position right from the beginning was that we are not going to accept nationalization. The American position was actually no different. Again, there was a misperception because the US had criticized AIC for being stingy. And actually, even the British government blamed AIC for being stingy. They argued that, well, AIC was run by Scots. You know about Scots stingy, that's why the problem was come. So even the British government was willing to agree that. But when it came to the question of nationalization, the American position was no different. Grady, the American ambassador, in fact, even though he was presented in Iran as being pro-Iranian, anti-British, he was adamant that anyone who advocated nationalization was a gangster. And he said, we should deal with the gangsters the same way we deal with them in Chicago. What does that mean? And this was a guy who was supposed to be pro-Iranian. So why was the American position as intransigent as the British? For the obvious reason that if nationalization was successful, it would have obvious consequences to American oil companies. And right from the beginning, the oil companies were adamant that the State Department should never accept nationalization because of what it would do and repercussions it would have internationally. And of course, it wasn't just oil they were worried about. You even find, nowadays if I say this, I sound like Jon Stewart at the late night show, but you find even United Fruit Company in Guatemala, as soon as they hear that the AIC has been nationalized, they write a report for the US Foreign Committee what this implied to bananas in Guatemala if the Iranians get away from it. So it sounds bizarre, but if you have to take it into the mentality of the people at that time, that the nationalization was considered a horrendous basically violation of norms that would have repercussions basically throughout the world if it succeeded. So the US position, I would say, was no different from the British in opposing nationalization. But what the Americans did, and this is McGee, George McGee, he actually designed what becomes then the main position of both the United States and Britain, which is we officially accept nationalization as a principle, but when you come to practice, it should not be implemented. Even before the Shah has signed the oil nationalization agreement, law, McGee actually rushes to Tehran to persuade the Shah not to sign the nationalization law. He can't get the Shah to sign because he says the atmosphere in Tehran is such there's no way the Shah could not sign. So what he does, and this is you can see it in the British ambassador's report, he designs this basically solution that we'll have the facade, this is the word actually used there, a facade or a charade of pretending we accept nationalization, but we will not actually support its implementations. So it becomes actually, you can say, a very clever and devious way of dealing with the situation, that we have nothing against the principle, but you shouldn't actually put it into practice. And of course, this was easy to get the British government to do it, because the Labour government had just nationalised a lot of industries. They couldn't obviously oppose nationalisation on principle. So the British readily came to this position that they accept nationalisation. But when you come to the actual negotiations, in the nitty-gritty of it, what the British and the Americans insisted on was that Iran should not actually run the industry, should not control the industry, but should have basically some sort of legitimate authority of it, but the actual industry should be run by people outside. The British obviously wanted the British, but the Americans wanted a consortium of foreign companies to run the industry. So this becomes basically the position, and you see it right through very consistently. You see it in the Harriman negotiations, the Stokes discussions, the Washington discussions, and I would say right through the whole 28 months or so, the British and American position is basically we will not permit you to run the industry, but we're willing to accept the theory in principle that you have nationalized the industry. So in much of the discussions, you have actually going around about things where the Americans and the British argued that they're trying to educate Mossadegh on the complexities of the industry, on the difference between prices in this Gulf and that Gulf, differences between crude and so this and different levels of oil. But what it really boiled down eventually, and this is where I actually have great respect for Mossadegh, he could cut through all this verbiage, all this camouflage, and go straight to the core of the issue. Eventually, who's actually going to make the decisions about running the oil industry? Will it be the foreign oil companies, or will it be the Iranian government? So he wasn't interested in being educated in the details. He was more interested in the bottom line of who was going to eventually control. And since they were not willing to give up control, it basically came to a loggerhead because they could get him not to budge from the question of giving up nationalization. Now, nowadays you could say, well, why was nationalization so important? Nowadays, of course, most countries have nationalized it. It's no longer part of our concern. Some people even call oil a curse. So if it's a curse, why have it? Why not give it back to BPian people if it's such a curse? You find even liberals in Iran now talking about oil as a curse. But you have to remember, in the early 50s, question of nationalization is highly important, not just in a question of dollars and shillings or pence terms. It's important because it's a question of national sovereignty, national identity. Iran, it's true, was never a colonial state, but it was a semi-colonial state. The colonial power being Britain, and Iran's way of getting independence was in fact to nationalize oil and basically declare its independence of the imperial power by taking over the industry. This is why nationalization was never seen in Iran as a question of money, simply as money. And the British were quite clear in this. In their reports they say, you know, it's not a question that the Mossadegh and the national movement is not concerned about basically a few dollars or pounds here or there. What they're concerned is about sovereignty. And of course, when you look at it as sovereignty national, then it is a zero game. You either get control or you don't have control. If it was a question of distribution of 50-50 or something like that, you could come to some sort of negotiations. But when it comes to the question of sovereignty and control, it basically boiled down to whether nationalization was going to succeed or not. And the British and Americans were adamant that it was not going to succeed. And if it succeeded, Iran would be punished to such a way that no one in future would even, in the future, would even contemplate nationalizing anything. And this has been relevant to what is often called the final offer Eisenhower made. This is something that usually people say, well, here was a very good offer the West made, and if only Mossadegh had accepted it, everything would have been fine. And again, you get this from liberals in Iran, that criticizing Mossadegh for not having accepted this Eisenhower's offer. If you look at the Eisenhower offer, and I suspect most people haven't looked at it, it was not an offer to accept nationalization. What Eisenhower's offer was that it was actually an offer made by the World Bank in consultation with the British and the Americans, that the issue would be postponed until a final decision was made by an international body on arbitration, and the arbitration would decide how much compensation Iran would pay for having nationalized it. And Mossadegh actually technically never rejected Eisenhower's offer. What he said, he gave a counter-offer. He said, yes, but we have to settle what the compensation would be based on. And his argument was that compensation should be based on what is the value of that oil industry to AIOC. And the British and the Americans were not willing to accept that. Why? Because actually the British had a very different definition of compensation. Their definition was fair compensation would be what was the profits of AIC at the very beneficial year, multiplied by the number of years that would go on till the end of the contract. And the American diplomat actually said they were thinking in astronomical terms. There's another American diplomat who says that actually if Iran had accepted this, Iran would be placed in bondage to the British for the next 25 years. And again, you have to credit Mossadegh for being suspicious enough not to accept the Eisenhower offer, because it was really a trap. And basically, if Iran had been able to get the West to accept nationalization, they would have been basically poverty-stricken for the next of the century. So there, I would say this idea that he was offered a compromise is completely off the wall. There was never a compromise offered. The American companies, actually, interesting enough, had a major role to play in these negotiations, not directly, but McGee, throughout his negotiations, was constantly in touch with the American companies. And the American companies were adamant that the State Department should not even contemplate nationalization. And these are the terms they use, that basically this would be the end of civilized world if countries like Iran get actually control over their oil. So they saw it in sort of sharp terms. Nowadays, you could say, of course, nationalization came in the 70s. The war didn't come to an end. The oil companies survived, but in the early 50s, it was in fact some considered a nightmare for the oil companies to contemplate the dangers of nationalization. So if for Britain and United States nationalization was not acceptable, then how were they going to deal with the situation? The British, I think from the beginning, were realistic enough that they couldn't get Mossadegh to give up the idea of nationalization. The American position was that they could sweet talk or hoodwink him into a settlement where he would, in appearance, have nationalized, but not in practice have accepted. But once that possibility was not there, and the Americans realized that it was not possible to get Mossadegh to give up sovereignty. Again, going back to the question of independence and sovereignty, this is often forgotten these days, even in Iran. If you look at the symbolic turnover, when Iran nationalizes the oil, the Iranian flag goes up, the AIC insignia comes down. This was at Iran actually seen as equivalent to India getting independence. It was like a declaration of independence from the colonial power. This was the way it was portrayed in Iran. It was also actually portrayed in very much the same way in Britain, that this was in fact a very symbolic sign of the end of an empire. And it's not actually accidental that one of the first greetings, congratulations that came to Iran with nationalization was from Nehru. The other one was from actually the Mexican president who had nationalized the Mexican oil company. So at that time it was seen as a sort of a declaration of independence. If you look at some of the British reports at that time, there's an interesting book by Norman Kemp. The book is called Abadan. He was sent there by a number of British journalists to cover the takeover of the facilities. And he is very, in fact, in tune with the significance, the symbolism of this going on. And he's a very proud Britisher. And he's very proud that as the BOAC plane takes off with the last of the British technicians, that the BOAC sort of dips its wings to salute the armada of the British fleet that's out there that could in theory have the capability of invading the country. So these symbolisms has to be seen in the context of really national insurgents. So I would say that to think that the British and the Americans actually accepted nationalization is going up the wrong tree. The reason that the failures of negotiation failed because they never were willing to accept that. So you could say a compromise could have been that if they accepted the nationalization, but then they worked on things that they were also concerned about, that Iran would sell fuel to Britain at a certain price and so on. So those sort of nitty-gritty of it could have been settled, but at a compromise at the cost of the oil companies, not at the cost of giving up nationalization. Now, turning to the Cold War. Now, as I said, the conventional wisdom is this all has to be explained in the context of the Cold War. Obviously, there was a Cold War at this time. No one in their sciences would deny the existence of the Cold War. But the question is, was this coup and the crisis really explainable in the context of the Cold War, or is an independent context of basically nationalism versus colonialism or imperialism? And at the time, the discourse was, of course, the Cold War. So obviously then you would expect politicians to resort to the notion of the Cold War to explain what they were doing. Though sometimes, in fact, throughout, I would say from 1945 till 1991, almost every politician, when they wanted to justify a policy, it was the Cold War. Sometimes it was on valid reasons, but often it could be completely arbitrary, non-valid reasons. And just to give you one example, I remember just before the revolution, the Shah, on his annual trips to Washington to buy arms, he came with a big shopping list of very sophisticated weapons he wanted from the Pentagon. And one of his advisors, who I knew from college days, called me and said, you know, he's come with this. He asked if I thought from American politics whether at that time the Congress would go along with it. I said, well, no, there's probably, you know, there's a lot of debate here now about one bullet state, and there's a lot of reluctance to give him all these weapons. And his answer was very automatic. Oh, but they can't do that, because if they don't sell the Shah what he wants, he can always go to the Russians and get it. So if you think about this, how legitimate is the fear of communism, the Cold War? Because in the same breath, you're going to your evil enemy to get something that your friend is not going to get. So the Cold War is, I think, a very convenient discourse to use, but not something actually real at that time. Of course, at that time, the two-day party did exist, but whether it was a threat or not is something different. If you look at the CIA information, the British documents at that time, they always poo-pooed the danger of communism in Iran. They would the British always considered a bogeyman. And they, of course, when they wanted to, would resort to it, but in confidentially and even much later in interviews, they actually used the term, this was a bogeyman, useful to use. But they were not, they didn't take the two-day party as a serious threat. The Americans themselves, in theory, said that it's possible sometime in the future there might be a danger, but they knew that in 1953 the two-day was not armed, was not actually thinking about a coup, and therefore was not an imminent threat the way it was presented, that what the coup was there in order to prevent an imminent Soviet takeover of Iran. Going back to the question of actually something important about the issue of nationalization. You know, when I did the research and really thought I'd come across something new, that the British-American position was that we openly accept nationalization, but in reality we don't. I thought I'd discovered something new. I hadn't actually. If you look at the very first book written on oil, Elvis Sutton's book, Persian Oil, There he has in passing something that goes to the core of it. He says, the phrase he uses is that, putting it very succinctly, the British attitude was they would accept nationalization if the Persians in return forego its implementation. So here in 1954, he's saying that, he's got to the core of it. He didn't have access to, of course, the documents to this position, but I think he was in tune enough, he'd worked in the oil company enough, he probably had enough friends in the oil company still, to actually get to the core of the issue, which a lot of historians since then didn't get to it. And also food for thought, Elwood Sutton's book was not published by a mainstream publisher. This is the best book on it, but it was basically published by a fringe publication. The issue of communism, then. How was it an issue in Iran? During Mossadegh's trial, the prosecutor kept on going back to the question of the Tudeh party, and Mossadegh's attitude that this was really basically a red herring, that there was no threat, and this was something, an argument that was being used to undermine his position. And he himself said, well, the Tudeh didn't have a single tank, a single machine gun, so why should I have been worried about them? Again, if you look at the British and American assessments, in a way Mossadegh was realistic. The Tudeh party could organize big demonstrations, strikes even, but that's a very different thing to carrying out a revolution or a coup. And since they were not in a position to do that, I think his realistic, basically, assessment of the situation was that he could tolerate the Tudeh party because they were not a threat. And he actually, one of his nephews had been a member of the Tudeh party, gave him frequent reports of what was happening there. So he was actually, you can say, he had his own personal information of the situation, and there could feel rest assured. If the Tudeh party or communism was not a threat, and if really oil nationalization was not accepted by the British, then the question becomes, why has these two issues become so dominant in the explanations of the coup? What goes at the core of basically explaining by liberal historians that the coup was basically unfortunate, tragic. We're sorry Mossadegh was overthrown, but basically we still have to realize that the coup had to happen because Mossadegh didn't accept nationalization and there was a fear of communism. So how does one explain the liberal overlooking of things I would say is fairly straightforward? One thing that you can say Elwood Sutton could see a long time ago. Well, one explanation, of course, is for so much of that period, most of our time, the Cold War was the dominant discourse. So when people used the argument of the Cold War, people accepted that as basically as a given. So it was basically, you can say, fitted into the culture, our modern culture, and it's easy to jump from one to the conclusion, even though at that time, if you look at the ground, people at that time were not really swayed by these type of paranoid fears. Some people will say, well, you know, people like Americans like Dulles, Eisenhower were so paranoid about communism, so they could easily, like a knee-jerk reaction, resort to a belief in communist threat. this is hard to believe, because these people, including Eisenhower, were in fact very pragmatic, hard-nosed politicians. They weren't naive people like who would be easily led astray by Woodhouse coming from London and saying, oh, the communists are going to take over, so you have to do something. These are very sort of hard-nosed people who look at reality. They would look at basically, again, how many tanks, how many machine guns does the other side have before they would jump to any conclusion. So they, as realists, would have accepted the fact that the danger of communism was not there. And people would say, well, of course, McCarthyism was rampant in Washington at that time, and therefore they were basically flowed with McCarthyism. Again, they're very practical people. There are no masses of people in America calling for a coup in Iran. It's not like public pressure that is leading them to the coup. They're looking at realistically, here is a man who's intransigent, won't give up the principle of nationalization. How are we going to get rid of him? And of course, what their policy was until Siavush was very much to work through the political system to get rid of Mossadegh, either to persuade the Shah to get rid of him or the Majlis. The Americans were in fact just as concerned about getting rid of Mossadegh from very early on. In fact, Harriman, once he was at the very beginning of this guy, when he saw the Shah, one of the things he discussed with the Shah is, can we get rid of Mossadegh? So it's not like after a long frustration that they shifted. They were interested in getting rid of Mossadegh from early on. When they discovered they couldn't, they basically then sweet-talked to him. And then when you come to the possibility of Ravon becoming prime minister, they were actually quite in favor of Ravon becoming prime minister. It would be interesting to see some of the documents that are still held back, because if you look at the foreign relations documents, there are huge gaps when it comes to the Ravon episode. And my suspicion is from the British documents that Henderson was just as adamant as the British were to replace Mossadegh with Ravon. And we can't prove that because the correspondence between Tehran and the State Department for these months are still kept classified. Hopefully they'll be declassified next year after about a 20-year delay. But it's very strange that communications would be still kept secret from the State Department at this period. So after Siavush, when the Ravon solution failed, Henderson's approach was not very different from the British approach, that the only way to get rid of Mossadegh is through a coup. The actual planning for the coup may have not occurred then, but from the Henderson, or at least from the reports the British gave, Henderson was already on board as that the solution is the coup. So final point is then, how does one basically explain why the liberal interpretation is so dominant, even though it really doesn't dally with the facts? Why is it distorted this way? I think a very important reason for this, besides the question of the discourse, the prevalent discourse of the Cold War, is that in American historiography, there's a long tradition of liberal historians to say that, yes, mistakes are made in foreign policy, whether it is Iraq or Vietnam, but these mistakes are well-intentioned, that basically people were well-intentioned, They were thinking of the benefit of not only the United States, but those countries. And if mistakes were made, it was from miscalculation, misinformation, and basically being misled by other people. But that basically US foreign policy is always has a premise that is well-intentioned. You actually, in the new documents that were released just last month, Malcolm actually, in a way, epitomizes this. He says that American foreign policy is always well-intentioned. And here, if you say, well, if the coup occurred because of the Cold War, then it's well-intentioned. It has nothing to do with oil. It's all to save the country from the evils of communism. And another trend you find in American liberal historiography is, of course, when you say it's well-intentioned, it has to, by definition, not be economically motivated. So when you automatically bring oil, which means something to do with the economy, then you're saying somehow American foreign policy is influenced by economic factors. Other countries can be always motivated by economic factors, but somehow US is exempt from this tendency. I don't know why, but somehow idea of being economically motivated is supposed to be bad. But the liberal perception seems to be that you start with that premise. And therefore, if you bring in oil, then you would think that the US was motivated by oil. Of course, the US wasn't interested in getting the Iranian oil. The US interest was actually preventing the spread of nationalization. But there is this insistence, and you find it in all the favorable books on Mossadegh in the West, that American interests in carrying out the coup had nothing to do with oil, because US had accepted nationalization. Some people say US had embraced nationalization, so they had no concern about it. But US real concern was about communism. And how can you prove this? Well, you prove it by, if you asked Eisenhower and Dulles, they would assure you that they were not motivated by issue of oil national. They were motivated by communism, fear of communism. So, to end with a quote from a 19th century philosopher, when we deal with ancient history, we don't judge characters in ancient history by their own evaluation of themselves. So similarly, when we're dealing with more recent history, one should be really skeptical of evaluating people by their own assessments of what they're doing by themselves. One really needs a heavy load of skepticism when one does history. I'll end there.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, can you hear me clearly through this wonderful technology? Now, one thing I forgot to mention, of course, which I should have at the beginning, but I'm going to blame Siavush for this, is that, of course, ERVAND's latest book on the coup is also out, which is just the latest publication to, that he's produced, which I encourage you all to get. We have a very short amount of time for questions. Hang on there. We have a very short amount, we'll have discussion afterwards. I would ask you to state your name and your affiliation, if any, and keep your questions short, please. And I'll go to start with Michael. Now, I have to come around with the microphone, which is a bit depressing, but you'll just have to wait.
Thank you very much. I'm Michael Axley from Exeter University. I thought that was an excellent presentation, and I think your emphasis on the need for a detailed examination of those negotiations between the Iranians and the AIOC and the Iranians and the British and American governments. I think that's very important. I think you're right that they haven't been examined sufficiently closely as yet. Having said that, I confess I probably am somewhat of a liberal in the characterization that you were drawing. There was one particular question occurred to me that I'd like to ask you. I think in Mark Gasiorowski's book, there's a mention of an encounter after the coup in August 1953 in London, where Kermit Roosevelt goes to see Winston Churchill, who by that time is in a pretty poor way, and Churchill supposedly was very enthusiastic about Roosevelt's activities in Tehran and was praising him very strongly. But he said as well, it seems, that he, Churchill, felt that the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company had made a real mess of things prior to that. Now, I was wondering as you were talking, you know, if it really was so much all or nothing, to some extent on both sides, a zero sum as you characterized it, then what was Churchill getting at there? In what way had the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company messed things up? I wondered if you had any thoughts on that.
Oh yeah, no, I think, yes, what he was getting at, and I think this is what the British Labour Party had always argued, is that basically the negotiations for rewriting the oil agreement, the 1933 oil agreement was renegotiated, that was called the supplementary oil agreement. That started really 1946, and from 46 to really 51 there were negotiations, and throughout these negotiations AIOC was very basically miserly, putting it. They were obviously trying to maximize profits, as any capitalist enterprise would be doing, and therefore they were unwilling to give many concessions. So the feeling here between the conflict was diplomats, both British, American, their feeling was that if the oil company had been more forthcoming, especially with the 50-50 agreement, there would have been no really crisis. Then that's debatable. But
was before Mossadegh.
Yeah. And in fact, it's the oil company says that eventually they did offer 50-50. I'm not sure about that, but if it was offered very last day of Rasmaraz. And then, of course, by then, nationalization had become the issue. I'm not sure if they had offered it earlier, if that would have solved the problem, because I think already once the Soviet oil agreement was cancelled, was basically never accepted, implicit was that oil should become Iranian. And in some ways, in fact, that you find in the Foreign Office, people even before saying, maybe it's a good idea if the Soviets get an oil concession in North, because then that would strengthen the British hold there. And if they don't get it, then the argument would be, for some people, going to talk about nationalism. So you get actually a pretty sophisticated analysis in the Foreign Office about this earlier. But usually the final analysis is fairly simplistic. And the idea here was the oil company shouldn't give in, and Churchill's argument would be if they'd given more concessions. And his thinking would be 50-50, which was what the Americans would have said. But that's one of the ifs. I'm not sure if there had been an offer 50-50, the nationalization campaign would not have been there.
Two more Just two more, so, sorry Chris, I'm not going to first here. And then Shaq. Short, please.
What can I say? Professor, when you downplay the threat of the Tudor party,
Sorry?
when you downplay the threat of the Tudor party, you seem to conveniently forget the Tudor party's infiltration into the Iranian military. If I was in power and there was this party that could organise large demonstrations, strikes, and also infiltrated the military, I would be very worried about this party taking over through a coup or a revolution. And my other question is about your figure of 3,000. You seem to present some assumptions as facts and then base your arguments on that. Where did you get this figure of 3,000 mob from? Because all the evidence suggests contrary to this. And I can carry that out, I can continue with that during the discussions why I think this 3,000 is a wrong figure.
The 3,000 I got from actually American reporters who were favorable to the coup. So it's not criticism of the coup. Of the 3,000 in the street. I'm talking about the 3,000 in the morning of Mr. Hashim-Mordad, which is then blown up to a people's uprising. So I would say maybe 3,000, 4,000. This is the figures that you would say American reporters give, who viewed the Shah as a hero. So it's not a critical view of that. Some people have argued, in fact I just heard a paper in Washington who gave pictures, and he would say that 4,000 is a big exaggeration, because if you look at the pictures, it's very sparse people in the streets. People you see are more tanks and soldiers rather than ordinary people in the street. So it's a stretch of the English language to talk about a crowd appearing on Mr. Hashim-Mordad. About what you call the infiltration of the Tudeh party in the military, and therefore this was a major threat. A lot of it's made out of this. If you again, the details in the devil, or the devil's in the details, if you really look at the officer organization, and there's a lot of mystique in this in the Tudeh party about the heroes in the officer organization. At most, it's 600 members. Some of them could have joined after the coup. So at the time of the coup, maybe 400 officers were in the Tudeh party. Sounds big, okay. 400 people, then the Tudeh party is about to take over the country. But you have to again look at the general figure. What does 400 mean? The Iranian officer corps was very top-heavy in 1953. 400 is a tiny percentage, probably about 2% of the officer corps. Then if you look at...
You say 40 officers carried out the coup, so 400 is not a threat.
Sorry?
You say 40 officers carried out the coup, and yet 400...
Yeah, no, I'm getting to my next point, is then you have to look at who these officers were. Officers who are in Balochistan guarding the border, or gendarmerie officers, or medical corps officers, or even officers teaching at the academy, are not in a position to carry out a coup. And the military organization, the Deuxième Bureau, or the whole intelligence service in Iran, was actually quite well run from 1941 with the help of the British here. And you get the inklings of this in the Foreign Office reports. From 41 onwards, what the Shah did, and here again the Shah is often underestimated, he was very careful at cultivating very close relations with the Army Officer Corps. And one way he did this was that above the rank of major, he had to personally actually okay it. He knew them or tried to know them. So what you had is from 41 onwards, very close monitoring of the officer corps and tracking of people into their careers. So anyone who expressed any sort of leftist tendencies was not necessarily purged from the army, but was sidelined to places like in Balochistan or areas that would not be of politically sensitive areas. And officers that were tended to be much more royalist were then promoted to sensitive positions. So it's not only in terms of rank, but also if you're going to carry out a coup, you basically, in the 50s, the coups were carried out by tank officers. So being an officer, let's say in a gendarmerie, is not going to put you in a position to overthrow a government. But if you're a tank officer, especially in Tehran, then you are in a highly politically sensitive position. So what you find is the garrison in Tehran is predominantly the tank officers are in fact royalists. So these are the 40 tank officers that Colonel Akhavi actually gives to the Shah. Here are the names of people willing to. So these are actually, you can say, already officers that are there. The problem the CIA had was that what Mossadegh and the Chief of Staff had done, the IA had done, had set up a sort of almost safe-proof system where these tank officers really couldn't carry out a coup because the barracks were under the control of the generals who were actually RIAI people who were army officers who belonged to the Iran party. So they, as top officers, could actually control the barracks. But both Akhavi and probably RIAI knew that a lot of the army officers that actually ran the tanks would be royalists. And this is, I would say, if a royalist was trying to make a hero of the coup, these are the heroes, the tank officers, but they often have disappeared in history. So that's the paradox of it. But, you know, carrying out a coup is not an easy thing. Just having a crowd in the street or having some officer guarding the border in Khuzestan is not in a position to carry out a coup to Tehran. And in the 50s, it was very, whether you look in Baghdad or in Tehran, in those days, then the coup thing was all basically garrison tank officers. And if the government loses control of those, it's easy for any government to be overthrown. Later on, Air Force becomes important. But in 53 in Iran, the Air Force wasn't a factor in the coup.
Right, thank you very much. I'm afraid we've run out of time and Oliver's waving at me at the back of the room. So we will have lots of time in the following session with Mark and Doj Randjbar coming to lead the discussion afterwards. I'm very pleased that I'll be handing over to Michael to chair that session. But there's obviously clearly plenty of food for thought there, and thank you very much for a highly stimulating and fascinating lecture. I can see this is the perfect time for us all to go off and get some caffeine just to get ourselves all sort of ready for the next 24 hours. So can we just show our appreciation once again for Professor Abrahamian?